Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Whew. It's been a very long time. I feel like it's been 1,000 years since we recorded a regular podcast about a chapter of the Dawn of Everything.
We're back.
We are actually back.
We're back.
We're going to be back in regular rotation here again.
Yeah, it's been a couple months since we recorded Chapter 6, The Gardens of Adonis. Do y'all remember that? But we've put out a couple episodes in the meantime.
Mm-hmm.
Garden of Eden, Against the Grain. And now we're back from, I guess it was kind of a halftime break.
The worst halftime ever.
Not a vacation.
No.
It was not, it was kind of thrust upon us.
Yeah.
By events.
Yeah. Not to go into too much detail, but I have a family health emergency. It's actually ongoing. While at the trauma hospital, I also caught a nasty, nasty case of COVID.
Yeah.
So sick. I'd had it before, but I had not been very sick. This was a bad one. I guess when you're really stressed and then you get COVID, your immune system's not fully functioning, turns out.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I'm glad you seem to be coming around.
I'm coming around, but wow, it was hard. That was hard. It's not fun to get really sick while you're also needing to go back and forth from the hospital and then can't suddenly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so grateful for that. And
it's hard to do it without you.
Yeah.
A podcast.
You did a good job. I listened to your Against the Grain episode and I did enjoy it. That was a good book report.
Did you read that book? I don't remember.
I haven't read it. No.
Okay. Right.
And, you made it sound like I should, but you did such a good job that maybe I won't.
I know. I'm afraid that maybe I did such a good job that now people won't read the book.
Yeah.
Because they think that I must have covered everything that's important about it. But,
right.
If that's the way that's going to be, then I guess that's okay.
Yeah.
Against the Grain might come up
today
again in this episode as we talk more about farming. And the ecology of freedom and the implications of farming, like early farming, all of this stuff.
Yeah, because it's kind of, this chapter is a little bit like of a piece, like it's almost like a two-parter.
Yeah.
With the last chapter.
Yeah. In Chapter 7, the ecology of freedom, and this is what this episode is going to be about. Well, maybe we should talk about where we left off.
Yeah, let's do that first.
Because there's been a lot of water under the bridge. But Chapter 6 was the Gardens of Adonis, and that was really the beginning of the treatment of early farming, early agriculture in the book. And you might recall that was where we talked about the idea of Neolithic matriarchy, Maria Gimbutas, like all of this stuff. There was actually quite a lot going on in that chapter.
Yeah.
But towards the end, we were left with this depiction of early agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, like specifically the lowland Fertile Crescent, and not just agriculture with a capital A, but just early cultivation of plants and domestication of grains, but also other plants, and just shifting cultivation and flood retreat agriculture, depictions that showed us that the beginnings of what we would come to call agriculture didn't look very much like irrigated fields of rows of crops or something like that,
But also that the progression, what we have learned from that archaeology has taught us that agriculture was not necessarily a sudden revolution. It was not.
Right. It
was not 1-to-1 with private property.
Right.
Being established.
Yeah.
And not necessarily 1-to-1 with hierarchy, from what it looks like.
Yeah. And in Chapter 7, they're going to kind of continue on this theme. Right. And
what's the whole title again?
It's called The Ecology of Freedom, or How Farming First Hopped, Stumbled, and Bluffed Its Way Around the World.
Right. So we get a little hint there.
Right.
They like to give hints in the subtitles of the chapters. Yeah.
Yeah. And Like a lot of what we're getting here is, and we'll get into this, but they leave the Fertile Crescent to talk about early farmers around the world, or in like 3 or 4 different regions around the world, that all serve as examples of the very different pathways that agriculture could take for people who adopted those things. You know, not all leading inexorably in this one direction. And sometimes in the case of one of the main examples, not even being successful and like working out for those people.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what we're getting here. I mean, it's a pretty short chapter. It's a nice depiction of like the diversity of different types of possibilities that people engaged with in different parts of the world at different times.
Yeah, and I will say that we'll get into the different examples, but it does, even just the brief discussion of a few different ways of doing agriculture, sort of makes you realize how much you assume a grain-based like monoculture as the norm. Or at least I realized that when I was, outside. I'm like, there's agriculture, and then there's all the other ways of doing things. And agriculture, I think we can have a kind of homogenous view of what that looks like, or at least that is what came up for me when I read this chapter.
Yeah, right. Because our ideas of agriculture, of what that means, of what the template of that is, are defined by the intensified and kind of monocultural types of agriculture that would later become associated with state formations, right?
Right.
That's kind of like how that probably works.
Right. Yeah, and I would also say that I personally think that this limited view of what is possible, or even what has happened up until now, has been reinforced from a lot of different fields and a lot of different kinds of thinkers, you know? And like, personally, I think that I probably still have a large amount of influence coming into my way of thinking from more of like the anti-civ way, you know, which we talked about earlier in the season, but like anti-civilization thinkers who conflate it all, and it serves the purpose of thinking of how this was a key part of things going to shit on Earth under human rule. You know, to narrow our way of thinking of agriculture as one kind of way of doing things, you know? And so, I don't know, it just reminded me again that I still have some things I need to maybe look at.
Well, yeah, and we'll, at the end of the episode, I think we'll give a little more time to talking about, there's another reason for that, and it's not just the influence of reductionist thinkers. It's like, we have to ask ourselves this question that's like, what do we make of the fact that when we zoom in and look at the kinds of cultures that we're going to look at in this chapter, and the examples of the way that early agriculture and domestication could go all these different ways, could result in like stable societies that did a little bit of cultivation, but a lot of foraging, you know, who never really went whole hog into cultivation. What are we to make of the fact that when we zoom into sort of a close and more fine-grained scale, we see all this nonlinearity, but then when we zoom back out to take in the broader strokes of history, we see this...
these broad stroke patterns.
We see this inexorable advance of agricultural-based life metastasizing and like becoming more and more dominant over the globe, starting at a certain point in history, right? And so that's not an untrue story, right? But the question is like, what do we make of the fact that at different scales of time, we see like pretty different stories and different possibilities, seemingly, right? What are we to make of that?
Yeah, we should go back to that.
You know, so maybe we can talk about that a little bit at the end after we've taken in some of the examples that the Davids have done this research to bring us.
Right. One thing they point out before we get into the examples is that they point to the widespread tradition of communal land tending, or communal, even distribution of land, but done in ways that feel fair to people. So people might have some level of private property, but each person in a community or family is given like a tract of land, and they're all about the same in quality or how good or bad the land is, and so they point to this partially to say that, like, to be clear, even when there has been agriculture over time, it's not necessarily always one in which there is private property and people accumulating wealth within that way of doing things. And they give a few examples.
Of how like land would be managed in common by people. Like they talk about the Russian Mir system, MIR, which is not a Soviet thing. It predates that, just for the record. And there was it was like the Scottish, like Rundale system. Oh, the Anglo-Saxon term, Rundale. And it's kind of an aside here at the beginning of the chapter, because basically what Janet was saying is what they're trying to say is that, like, let's just dispense with this idea that cultivating crops necessarily implies private land ownership. Like you just have to go there from that one activity or whatever.
And I think they just want to say that briefly here because they don't want to, like, as we go through these different examples, they don't want you to go ahead and put your preformed supposition of how this works on these cultures as we talk about them. So, like, we can say that if there are often examples of communal land distribution and sharing of land management, there probably were in prehistory as well.
Yeah, for sure. Right. Yeah, that's true, because often it's like, if you're looking at archaeological sites, it's really hard to say unless they had writing, like how land was managed or something. But we can see from historical times, that there's all these different examples. And the great scholar of this managing of land in common was Eleanor Ostrom, and they cite her and one of her famous books as like a place where they have culled a lot of information from and where like you could go to read more, so yeah, but they don't spend a whole lot of time on that.
Another thing they do draw attention to before we go into these examples is that there's a way that historians and theorists of history, anthropology, sometimes even, will talk about agriculture spreading, almost like it's just like an idea that catches on, like a meme in the conventional sense of meme, that like agriculture just spread. This practice spread, these animals spread, this way of working with the land spread. And they have some things to say about that and how that it's not that simple, right? One concept that they point to as a way that we might inadvertently think about this movement of like ways of doing things and plants and animals is the Columbian Exchange, which a lot of you may already know what that is, but it's a concept, that term was coined by Alfred Crosby, who was a historian?
A geographer.
A geographer, that's right. He's a geographer. And he just named what happened after its Columbian Exchange, as in Christopher Columbus. And that after that contact/conquest, how many animals and plants moved in both directions, but especially in the direction from colonizer to colonized lands. And a lot changed from the Columbian Exchange, right? Like the idea that there were not earthworms here.
Yeah, honeybees.
No honeybees, right?
Yeah,
like on Turtle Island. And
but also pigs and like a lot of other,
and of course
more
a lot
prominent
of infectious diseases, so we're going to like the microorganism level as well. And then yes, there was an exchange, like tomatoes went to Italy, so there could be marinara sauce. Potatoes went from South America to Ireland, and to Europe. There was like some level of movement back and forth, but primarily in the settler colonial project, people brought what they wanted to bring with them to the colonized lands, as they were colonizing, and some were inadvertently brought, like the microorganisms, which sometimes were not inadvertently brought, sometimes they were intentionally spread. But, the bugs that came with the animals were not always intentionally spread around. But one thing that is true is that that paradigm that we talked about earlier in the season of like what agriculture is supposed to look like, that form of interacting with the land, this more extractive relationship with producing food, that was absolutely enforced and put down onto the new landscapes around the globe.
Right.
And so you'll see, like, say England turns everywhere they colonize into a sheep farm if they can,
Right.
And you start to see a much more homogeneous landscape. So part of what the Davids are pointing out right here is that we have this idea of a certain kind of agricultural spread that's actually one that's much more imperial. And actually, Alfred Crosby referred to it as ecological imperialism, where like empire is spread through changing the ecologies that it interacts with.
Yeah, this part was I thought it was a little bit vague what the Davids were trying to say. So what they're trying to point out here is that we have this template in our minds. I mean, if we know something about history and stuff, that we have this idea about the spread of a certain kind of mode of subsistence or whatever you want to call it. And the template is the colonial spread of European kind of ways of doing farming and agriculture and stuff, right?
Right.
Yeah. But they're bringing it up here kind of to say that we shouldn't have the Columbian Exchange in mind when we're thinking about the spread of agriculture at the earliest times.
Right. I think that
the risk of that is what? Or to think that it was like more imposing than it really was?
I think that that's the point. I think that they're trying to point to the settler colonial agricultural paradigm being one that was about dominating peoples and land as it spread. And enforcing a way of doing things, partially for extraction, because they're colonies that are the resources are being sent back to the colonizing state, right? Or somewhere else from there, depending on the resource, right?
Right.
And so it's definitely like very hegemonic, and it's a tool. It's a tool for domination, right?
Yeah.
And I think that part of what they're saying is that if we have only that model for agriculture spreading, then we're going to not understand all of the ways agriculture might spread that are less about domination.
Less aggressive,
yeah.
Something.
So...
Okay, that's a fair point.
I think that, as they say at the beginning, and as we will talk about as we move through this, is that in prehistory, from what we know from archaeological evidence, people would adopt different forms of practices we might call agriculture as part of a web of ways of doing things.
Yeah.
And they might not necessarily make it their core identity, or if they did, they might move out of that, and that it's just not as linear. And it starts, sometimes it fails, sometimes it does progress, but it's not, people move in and out of it. There's just like more...
There's a lot of diversity of the way that it would... Yeah. I mean, and some kind of sometimes colonial incursions would also fail. But it's just a different plot line. It's a very different plot line than what they're trying to talk about here. Right. So I guess they're sort of they want to inoculate us against... seeing things as this very backed by power. Yeah, because part of what they're trying to undermine is that, and they say this very explicitly in the chapter, is they're trying to undermine the assumption that agriculturalists always had the upper hand.
Right. That's right.
Wherever they were moving in on some land.
Yeah, or that the
migrating into some place, or
that the agriculturists are the violent ones, or they're more warlike, or that they.
No, that's true too.
They're also saying that. So yeah, we will get to more examples, but I think what they're pointing to is real. That we can sometimes have an idea about agriculture if you already have some unexamined assumptions about agriculture and empire always being 1-to-1 going together.
Yeah,
and that. the way that looked in the settler colonial history that we are part of can predispose you to thinking that agriculture spreads through domination.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, that is one story of agriculture, but not of all agricultures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And then, right, so that's kind of a setup for their overall picture. In this chapter, we really do get more of a global picture of the rise of domestication, cultivation, and agriculture. I want to say, as just an aside, that I say all three of those words sometimes because they're actually three different moments in the possibility space that is like enacted by this new world, right? Like cultivation has its own kind of definition that has to do with favoring the growth of certain plants rather than others. Domestication has to do with breeding and taking some kind of control over the reproduction of a species. And agriculture, has kind of its own meaning. And so we're talking about all of that and more in this space. We're not always just talking about agriculture, capital A. Sometimes we're talking more about, shifting cultivation or lower intensity type of methods or something. So it's like, I want to resist the urge to just have one word for all of these things that we're talking about. So I at least will sometimes be throwing out a kind of scattershot of words to talk about the themes of these chapters, because it really is all these things, and even that is really not good enough if you want to be super descriptive. But anyway, we've got to draw the line somewhere.
And they do a little bit of lumping in this chapter, so sometimes it can feel like you want to do a little more splitting.
Yeah, maybe a little bit. Yeah. They have a section in the chapter that's called "Why Agriculture Did Not Develop Sooner," right? And so, we've already talked about the beginnings of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, but here they sort of back up and they take this global perspective and they're like, why now though, And they tell a story that we've already kind of covered a little bit, but it has to do with the move from the Ice Age into the Holocene and the warmer and wetter, more fertile climate, more water. And part of what they want to make sure that we understand about the movement into the Holocene is that above all, or at least before all, it was the golden age of foragers. That we shouldn't be thinking about this transition in time. And by transition, I mean from one geological age into another, right? One climatic age into another climate kind of regime, right? As just like a bunch of mammoth hunters that one day invented agriculture and started doing this other thing. No, there was a whole much more complex thing happening where going into the Holocene, there was just all this massively improved foraging habitat that emerged at that time where, I talked about this in the Against the Grain episode like a little bit, but just like wetlands became super abundant with life. A lot of like really robust and populous foraging societies established themselves on coastlines everywhere. Like the whole long coastline of Europe was just dense with foragers who were living off of like the river deltas and the coastal habitats and getting into boats and fishing and doing all this stuff. And that these people were like developing a lot of what anthropologists call complexity in their cultures, with like really adorned burials and, like really high culture in the absence of domestication or agriculture, and that it was a explosion in population and just cultural diversity among foragers. And there's actually, it's kind of short, but there's like 2 or 3 really beautiful paragraphs in here that actually talk about this Mesolithic, is what they call it, early Holocene tableau of the types of wildlife and the types of subsistence or, just like abundance that was available to foragers at the time. And this also created conditions where cultivation and eventually agriculture would also become a favorable activity, but that the early agriculturalists and the cultivators were, and like this is especially important when we're thinking about people who were really trying to live off of agriculture largely and kind of specialize in that, that these folks were trying to establish themselves in vast territories that were dominated by foragers who were living really well.
Right.
You know?
Yes.
So that's kind of the setup. And the first case study that they present are actually people who migrated into Central Europe ready to set up agriculture in like 5500 BC.
Right. And it seems like they brought a lot of their, like they brought seeds with them, they brought tools with them, like they seemed ready to set up a farming community.
Yeah, these were folks that, I mean, I guess that we can kind of think of them as like a ripple out from Fertile Crescent.
Seems like it.
Beginning of agriculture, because I think they directly migrated from, I think it said the Balkans, like maybe, you know, which was just like a hop away from the Fertile Crescent. So yeah, they discuss a number of archaeological sites, cultures that are described in archaeology as part of the linear pottery tradition. If you were going to look these people up, that's how you would do it, like the linear pottery people. And that they arrived in the Less plains, like that word Loess, which is a type of soil, plains of Austria and Germany, what's now Austria and Germany. And this was, according to the Davids, this was a place that was, it didn't have a lot of foragers inhabiting it. Because the way that they make it sound is that the foragers were all like, you all take the interior and we'll be on the coast.
Right.
Or something. And I'm not sure about how robustly accurate that characterization is, but these folks migrated into this uninhabited plain where the soil was pretty good for agriculture with a agricultural toolkit, like you were saying. Like they came with their seeds, like they were agricultural people who were doing a migration. They weren't like nomadic people, but they were like ready to like plant their towns.
And importantly, they had grain. They had a couple kinds of grain they were growing.
Yeah, wheat.
And there's evidence of that.
And they had domesticated animals,
and they had domesticated animals. And so part of what they're trying to do in this chapter is move out from the Fertile Crescent and discuss different agricultural histories around the world, right?
Yeah.
And so this one is actually one that's still a grain culture.
Yep.
You know? And I guess if I'm remembering this correctly, they inhabited this area doing their farming for about 1,000 years. Is that
the timeline? The timeline in here is like 5500 BC is when they first appear. I think.
Got it.
And then I believe they say that around 5000 BC you start seeing signs of, I don't know, trouble.
Yeah.
Where there's clear evidence of like economic disparity, and you also see like fortifications that are built around some of the settlements, and there's weaponry and maybe some signs of warfare. So, you know, either they were being raided from the outside or they were warring amongst each other, these people, or something. It's like, I don't know if that's known, but 5500 BC is when they appear. They set up shop, they start growing things and stuff, and then 5000 things are starting to look different. And then by 4500 BC, there's like mass graves and the society is basically crumbling and is about to just be extinguished.
Right.
You know, so I guess the main takeaway here is just that even like skilled farmers can just have a dead end. Right. Even in a place that's like ecologically well suited for what they're trying to do.
That's one thing that it seems to be part of the point. I mean, it is part of the point, but then also I think there is something here in that they seem to have been raided by foragers, probably. There's some evidence for that. Yeah. And that, and it was pretty violent raiding. A lot of killing. Seems like young childbearing women taken because their bodies were not among the other in the graves.
Right. And there's like an interesting detail that's just like a little window into the methods of archaeology or something, where some of the skeletons that were found among the foragers on the coast were of people, and I think it was like women in particular, who they could tell from analyzing the skeletons that their bodies were formed of terrestrial protein, land mammals, instead of fish protein. Right. And so, you know, one can deduce from that they hadn't been on the coast for very long, or else they would have been eating more fish, and there would be signs of that in their skeletons or something.
Yeah.
So this is like some evidence that might lead one to believe that interior people who were eating, more terrestrial protein had been like captured or maybe left and were refugees from the interior culture and were taken in by the coastal people.
Yeah.
You can't say, but for some reason they had ended up there.
Yeah.
Anyway, I thought that was kind of an interesting little
really
detail.
interesting. I have no idea how they do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they also, part of what they're bringing this up for too is that like they want to show that like, yeah, like here's a failed, I mean, it's failed, but it did last 1,000 years. I mean, it's still a pretty long time. It's not like still with us, but they consider this a failed agricultural experiment, but partially they're trying to show like, yes, agriculturists don't necessarily dominate everyone around them. And in fact, can just get picked off by raiders like anybody else.
Right.
And they also want to point to there being like this decline in population. And it's not just exponentially increasing over time because of caloric stability.
Yeah, right. It seems to be a case study that proves that just being able to do agriculture, even in a pretty favorable location for it, does not guarantee that you are like demographically just going to like expand and increase.
I mean, what I will say though, and maybe this will come up more after we talk about the other examples, but I'm struck by also the reality of these people's material conditions, which is that, they're sedentary. They get raided by a more warlike or militarily more advanced forager culture. Yeah. And, when we've talked in some of the other episodes about how farming communities sometimes begin to have to build up defenses to prevent raiding and to protect their assets and their people, their women. And, when that's an issue, sometimes that can lead to people to submit to governance because they are being offered protection.
Right.
And so there are ways that this example actually could be proving some things or giving, example of things that the Davids are not that into acknowledging.
Yeah, it doesn't contradict some other familiar stories that we have about sedentism, agriculture, fortification, warfare. Yeah. Protecting the surplus, governing the surplus, these types of things.
And sedentary living,
Sedentism, yeah. Yeah. It's really amusing to me in the chapter, the Davids make this into a cliffhanger.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Where they say that this culture vanished at 4500 BC in a presumably kind of violent way. And then they're like, we'll return to this later. And I mean, I'm just going to say it now.
Spoiler.
They come back towards the end of the chapter and reveal that although these people were, they were skilled farmers and they succeeded for, the Davids are painting this as a failure, but they were there for 1,000 years.
Right.
I mean, that's pretty good. The Davids reveal that they had come into this area with a somewhat reduced agricultural toolkit from what had originally been developed in the Fertile Crescent, and like instead of the original 3 varieties of domesticated wheat, these people only came with 2, and instead of the 5 domesticated pulses, the legumes, they only came with 2 or something like that, and that's it. Like that's about the evidence, but the interpretation that they propose is that they had, which I think is reasonable, that they were dependent on a very simplified food web. Right. Like basically where they had fields that were kept fertile from the manure, from their cultivated animals. They lived off of the animals and then these couple of crops. Like apparently there's evidence that they didn't have a super diverse subsistence that was like a lot of wild food or something. I mean, they don't say that in here. It's a little hard to believe that they didn't like hunt and forage a lot from the wild, but they're kind of painting them out to be that these people had a kind of brittle, fragile kind of culture that was only built around a small number of interlocking food items that were all like domesticated. And then if any one of them failed for any amount of time, then it would send the whole system into disarray.
Right. And we know just from more modern history that when you depend too much on a few food crops, that is not an adaptive way of living.
Oh, yeah, right. I mean, it's a plausible story because we know about, like, this is a real thing.
Right.
Is, over-reliance on a small number of, if you oversimplify a system and that there's no, like, redundancies in it and fallback options or whatever, then that system becomes very fragile. And that's basically what they're proposing spelled the demise of these early agriculturalists in the European interior.
Right.
So that's one story.
Yeah.
But the Davids want to shine the spotlight on some other examples. All the remaining examples are of farming people who they did well.
Yeah.
And these seem to be included, especially like the next two that we're about to talk about, just to show the diversity.
Yeah, I think so.
Basically.
Right.
And I think because they conform to their overall schema, that these are people who were taking advantage of territory left behind by the foraging societies. That were taking up a lot of the good land.
Right.
So they have that feature in common. But yeah, they start with Africa.
Yeah. Specifically the Nile Valley, what's now Egypt and Sudan, or part of Egypt and Sudan.
Yeah.
And this is a part of the lumping situation. These folks were more about domesticating animals. They seem more pastoral and they're moving around with their animals, with their livestock.
Yeah, they weren't actually farmers.
Right. Although they kind of call them that. It's confusing to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's all the terminology is really difficult.
Right. And I know that is domestication of animals and plants
animal husbandry
go
part of agriculture.
Right.
To some people it is.
Some people it is. Some people would be wanting to paint with a finer brush than that. But these folks moved around. I mean, they don't talk really at all about their plant relationships. I'm going to assume they were wild tending as they went, partially just because they're probably going to want to be diversifying their food while they move around.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, pastoralism in itself is a form of wild tending.
That's true, I guess. Yeah.
Because, I mean, I don't know a lot about this, but I know that, like, grazing practices have a lot to do with shaping the landscape.
That's true.
And so anyway, that's a total aside, but
that's true. It doesn't really make sense to separate it out when you're like moving ruminants around who are grazing and eating what they come across. And they only point out a couple of things about these folks. One is that what you already mentioned, they kind of kept in areas that were not already dominated by foragers.
This was a time period, interestingly, where the Nile Valley, or at least this one part of it where these people were at, was not inhabited.
Yeah, it's confusing to me.
And so they talk about, there's like a complex of...
This is 5,000 to 4,000 before the current era, by the way.
Right. Yeah, and these were cattle people, right?
Yeah.
The depiction here is pretty cursory. It's just kind of like, it talks about how they inherited the agricultural and animal domestication innovations that were coming from the Fertile Crescent. Like those technologies, I guess it's known or whatever, like came
into the area
across the Red Sea and into Africa proper and influenced people there. And there were in fact like more serious like agricultural farming communities that were to the west of where these people would have their zone, but they have this thing where they say it's kind of like these folks received the package, they opened it up and they threw out the stuff that they didn't want and they like repackaged it into their own thing, which was a nomadic pastoralist, cattle domesticated way of life. Obviously that wasn't all that they were consuming. It's a little bit unclear. And we get a little bit of description of their body adornment.
Oh, yeah.
Which is interesting. Right. Like, throughout this chapter, like, you can see the Davids' roots in cultural anthropology, like really coming forward. Like, they really like to give us a sense of, just the cultural details of the expression, like the way these people express themselves in life.
Right.
Too. And so we get a little bit of that.
Part of what's important about these peoples they're talking about in the Nile Valley is, their proximity to pretty established agriculture.
Yeah.
Probably trading some with these people, knowing how to do it, having agricultural very nearby, but being like, yeah, we're gonna do the other thing, because one of the things about that we inherit with the historical framing of agriculture is that it's like this irresistible.
Oh yeah, like if you were in the Nile Valley and you knew about it, you would obviously do it there.
Obviously doing it. Yeah.
You would obviously like grow grains in the flood, and that would happen there eventually.
Eventually, right.
But they're saying it hasn't. It didn't happen at first, even though these folks had the toolkit.
Right. They had the toolkit, and maybe there was some schismogenesis going on. Like, we don't really know, but like, it's a good 1,000 years of folks just being like, we're going to stick with the pastoral way. We're doing this thing. We like the animals. We might take some other parts of your life, but we're not going to just sign up for this staying in one place and growing food.
Yeah. Yeah. Right? Cool.
So that's like kind of the point.
That's part of it too.
Yeah.
Right. There. Yeah. Is just to show that people picked and chose.
True. Yep.
Picked and chose what from this gift of a toolkit they wanted to do.
Right.
Based on, stuff that, we probably can't even totally reconstruct from our vantage point now, why they were making these choices necessarily.
Well, and this actually reminds me of something I was thinking when I read this whole thing, is that, it's interesting that there would ever be a narrative that was otherwise, because there's always people choosing otherwise. There's currently pastoralists who don't do a lot of agriculture,
But there are kind of these more materialist, broad stroke things that say, like, the Arabian Peninsula was full of pastoralists because it wasn't great land for agriculture.
Right.
But you could take your goats into the hills and do, or, part of the reason why the western U.S. is full of cattle and is the heartland of ranching or something is partially because you can get a yield off of that.
Yes.
When you can't grow crops there exactly without irrigation and stuff, right? So there are materialist explanations for some of this, but they want to point to examples that would seem to go against the grain of the materialist explanations.
Right. Because it's so close to the Nile. That presumably this is great farmland.
Yeah, flood retreat, like they were doing flood retreat already in the Fertile Crescent, and they could just do it here, but it took them a while to adopt that, supposedly. Yeah, right. So that's all good. I feel like we've unpacked that example
a little
better
bit
than they did, even maybe. Or we definitely took longer talking about it than it would take to read the 2 paragraphs that they have about that example in there, which is good. This is what this is part of what we're here for.
This is why we're going to spend a year talking about this book.
Yeah. Oh my God. If you want to see us just follow all the possible threads and answer all the kind of questions that this book raises as a permanent podcast from now on, sound off in the comments and we'll see if we can entertain your request.
I think there has to be an end in sight. Yeah.
Because it's definitely possible. I've been like, we should do an episode just on this, or I should get this guest on and interview them or whatever. Like, we could just unpack what's in this book for eternity. But let's at least move along to their next example. Their next example, we move over from Africa to Oceania. And we follow the tracks of...
the wake.
Yeah, we follow in the wake of what's called the Lapita Horizon. Is that right? Lapita. And these are people who are also known by the pottery that they left behind. It's really interesting how this is one of the ways that people are categorized. It's like in more modern times, it's by their language family or something, but in archaeological, it can be by pottery. Anyway.
This is 1600 to 500 before the current era, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And these were folks who kind of they broke off from Southeast Asian people who had millet and rice as main domesticates, these grains. But these were folks who they had that toolkit, but they were motivated for whatever reason to take off and island hop on boats.
Yeah, they had big seafaring canoes, right? Or
Yeah.
that kind of boat, like open rowing boats.
Yeah, these were people who would use deep ocean outrigger canoes and just like kind of really incredible ocean navigation skills to inhabit like all of these different strewn out islands throughout Oceania, including Samoa and Tonga and Fiji. These were the people who initially settled those islands. But rice and millet were poorly suited to the places where they were heading, so they quickly cast those aside and just started kind of picking up tubers and bananas and shit along the way. And they had this sort of evolving toolkit of domesticates, including domesticated pigs, and that they carried with them to all these different islands. And it seems like it kind of evolved along the way as they would encounter like a useful species and would take, you know, cuttings and stuff or tubers with them along the way. And so they spread like a particular culture associated with this lapita pottery, and that was like pigs, root crops, and like, you know, starchy fruits and banana type crops and things like that.
And it seems like, once again, these were islands that were not inhabited by humans yet before they showed up. And so they would show up. Presumably, these were also people who were foraging as well, you know, as they went, and learning the different plants of the different places, and then establishing their preferred changing group of staples as they went. Right.
So they would kind of come onto these islands and modify the ecology. I mean, obviously, pigs really modify the ecology.
They really do. I was thinking about that when I read that was one of their main food staples.
And like co-create a way of life that they could inhabit in these places that was based on the encounter of their plant companions that they were traveling with, and their pigs and their, I think, dogs maybe too, onto these islands with their pre-existing set of wildlife and plants and things too. They're careful to point out that, you know, that these are also people who avoided strongholds of habitation already. Like the island that we now call Papua New Guinea had a pretty robust farming culture there. And, you know, they skirted around Papua New Guinea. They didn't try to set up in Australia, which was already a stronghold of foragers going way back, actually. And they just carried on onto uninhabited islands. That's about it for those folks. We do get a little bit about their tattoos.
Yeah, we know that they were very tattooed. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that I'm always impressed whenever I learn about the early seafaring peoples navigating the zones, especially the Pacific, where the islands are very far from each other sometimes. And like, you know, these folks were just ingenious with navigation and with making these seafaring boats, you know?
Yeah.
That you would haul pigs on, you know? I mean, they really, I don't know. I think it's such an interesting culture, even though we don't know much around them, but we know later examples of Pacific Islander culture that's just amazing at navigation, you know, and sea life, you know.
One of the things that, like, you know, I'm a book nerd and I've looked at a lot of books in my life and been influenced by a lot of things that I've read, but I still have this image, not just a visual image, but just a mental image, like seared, like branded into me, that came by way of, and maybe some of you all know this one, but it's from Bill Mollison's Permaculture Designer's Manual. And there's a part in there, there's a really cool chapter on pattern recognition. And it's really just about this primal ability of recognizing pattern in the world around us and using that to navigate, right? So all kinds of patterns. And there's an illustration of one of these Polynesian outrigger canoes, and it's trying to illustrate all of kind of the patterns in the landscape that were being read, or the seascape that were being read, quote unquote, you know, by the people on the canoes as ways to navigate between these tiny islands in this giant ocean.
Yeah.
And it has to do with like there's like one of the guys on the boat is kind of singing or chanting something that's in a particular like rhythm, and then the way that the rhythm of those vocalizations are interacting rhythmically with the lapping of the sea on the hull of the ship, and the rhythm of that is something that is a pattern that's read, like whether it's making a certain kind of Doppler, effect in one direction or another, is like that's something that's read. And then, there's obviously someone who's looking out, but then there's like a guy who's hanging his testicles into the ocean, because testicles can pick up minute fluctuations in temperature.
Right.
And so that would be like, that's another pattern that's being read in the landscape and being used for navigation, like, oh, just dropped like 1 degree. And, knowing something about the currents and having an idea in their heads of the maps of the currents, being like another way. But anyway.
Yeah. And of course the stars.
Yeah, the stars are in there too. Yeah. And, so all of these are different maps, a sound map, a temperature map, a star map, and they all overlay to create this navigation thing. And yeah, I mean, there's like a lot of ways to cut up my life, but one of them it would be like before I saw that page in the book and after, right? Because it really just,
it's amazing.
Yeah, it's really breathtaking to think about what people can do and have done.
The one last thing I would just mention before we move on is that, and actually we should probably talk about the title of the chapter, but the ecology of freedom is the way they're describing people's capacity for not being tied to agriculture, for being able to have some of it if they want it, and being able to move in and out of it. Partially.
That is partially
what they're saying. I mean, they took the term from Murray Bookchin, but they're not using it the way that he used it, really.
Yeah, right. I think they were inspired by this term from Murray Bookchin. They like the phrase.
They like the phrase,
and they apply it here. And probably the best example, or at least the deepest and most extensive example of this ecology of freedom that they're trying to like sketch out is the next example, which is true. Amazonia.
Right. Well, maybe then let's talk about that, and then I'll come back to the thing I was thinking about, these other examples in relationship to that term. How about that?
If that works.
Okay.
Their last and most extensive example, and in a lot of ways, the most interesting. I mean, I guess it's the most interesting in this chapter because they spend the most time on it.
We don't learn a lot about the other groups.
We're going to the Amazon, and they lead into it by pointing out that we're going to go to a place where it's a little bit different than what we've already talked about, because the Europeans, the Africans, and the Lapita, Oceania people were all what they call in here serious farmers.
Oh, right.
Meaning that like those examples are of folks who they really did rely on their
crops
toolkit of domesticated species.
Right.
for most of their subsistence. Like they were like wedded to their toolkit.
Mm-hmm.
But the Amazonian example that they want to highlight now is kind of different than that.
Mm-hmm.
The aspect of Amazonian culture that they're pointing to in this part might be familiar to people who've read or heard about like Amazonian agroforestry or shifting cultivation, like the food forest of the Amazon and things like that. They're pointing towards the cultures who had a way of interacting with the jungle in a way that involved clearing some land and then like massively planting it with a bunch of different trees and shrubs and, you know, food, fuel, and fiber plants and annual crops, and then having that all grow up eventually as the plants matured, and then it just became part of the
forest.
It was the forest, and then plots would be cleared so that there would be all stages of succession that were happening available to, you know, certain people at a certain time. This is what gets pointed out sometimes as these huge swaths of anthropogenic forest, basically, where what seemed to colonizers to be like just the wild jungle of the Amazon, a wilderness, was actually, you know, the long-term results of people doing these clearing and planting operations that shifted up and down the river valleys. And this is also, they mentioned the terra pretas, the black earth anthrosols, the sort of like human engineered soils that were super fertile, unlike a lot of the pre-existing soils in the Amazon basin that were created by the application of charcoal to, you know, human feces and compost and stuff to create these really fertile soils. Anyway, this section is about all of those practices. And these forms of cultivation go back, like what, at least to like 7,000 BC or something?
A really long time.
Elements of it anyway.
Right.
Know. And eventually you have like actually domesticated species like manioc that come into the picture.
Yes.
But what they try to highlight is that even the domesticated species are just often just part of this mix of interacting with wild species and just planting wild species and growing everything in this kind of wild-ish type of way and environment, and only even working to improve the soils and create these black earths in very specific types of environments.
Well, and also, before we move on, I just want to emphasize that this like soil building, this earth building is a very long-term project.
Yeah.
You know, and it's one that includes the charcoal from the fires. It includes the humanure, so their own manure, the manure of any animals that they're keeping. They have a wide variety of pets from the wild animals of the jungle. That they talk about, and that's still true of a lot of Amazonian tribes, from what I understand. That they will adopt the offspring of animals that are killed in the hunt and raise them up and keep them as pets. And travel with them, you know.
Right, totally.
Whether those are monkeys or parrots or like other animals too.
Yeah.
It's like a weird version of domestication, because it's not like they're domesticating them for necessarily like food. And they don't like maybe breed wild animals, but they adopt wild animals.
Right.
You know, and keep them around. But anyway, the soil, when they build good soil, it's a very long-term process, right? And that's just something that's worth pointing out, partially because, I don't know, they're an interesting example because the Davids point to them partially as folks who just like do some agriculture here and there, or we would maybe say cultivation here and there, but they aren't identifying as farmers so much. They're still very much like foragers. They're doing this intensified foraging where they're also wild tending and planting.
And sometimes they're actually still like nomadic.
Right.
Or they're nomadic for part of the year.
Right.
Like in an earlier chapter, maybe you remember they talked about the Namaquara. This is it's not those same people.
Right.
But they use them as an example of folks who during the rainy season, they stopped moving around, did some cultivation, and then for another part of the year, they would like go and forage. And in Amazonia, you see this pattern too, where it was more advantageous and just more appealing, to do cultivation at a certain time of the year, but then they would plant stuff and it would be stuff that they could circle back around to like later.
Right.
So they're like enhancing their habitat.
Oh, it's kind of like the Oceania folks too, where it's just like you put the species you prefer on all the islands that you visit.
Yeah.
So that you can go back and always have the food that you want. Like they're doing that, but throughout like all of these different jungle corridors along the river.
Right. You're like, oh, I'm so glad I stuck this banana pup in the ground here, 20 years ago, because look at all these bananas I can come.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's true. I mean, so we should talk about how like in this chapter they refer to what these Amazonian people are doing as play farming. And I think that they mostly just mean to be like, it's not like they have to do it. But, I don't know. I know a lot of people have problems with that, their choice here with that term. But it is true that it feels kind of almost Scheidel brings it up, but I'm sure he's not the only person. But it's interesting because they like it. They like the play. They keep reinforcing that term. It does kind of feel...
minimizing or something. Play. Who doesn't like to play? Play is nice. But yes, what Janet's saying is true. Even this part of the chapter is called "On the Case of Amazonia and the Possibilities of Play Farming," right? Which is in quotes, but it's quotes of they're quoting themselves. Like they're like on what we call play farming, right? You suggested that maybe a better word would be casual farming, right? Because that at least gets away from the implication of play as something that's inconsequential.
Right. Well, part of what I was wondering is, in the last chapter, we got to learn all about these like women scientists and how they developed all this new tech, and they were just always experimenting and learning and working with the plants, and it was so cool, and they're doing all this science. And I don't know. I'm like, why is that science and this is play? Like what, when you're like, when these people are learning to work with all these different plants and ways to establish ecologically rich, diverse forest gardens, basically all around that they move through in different stages of development as a way of life.
Yeah.
What part of that is just play, I guess. And why, I don't know. I'm actually still kind of confused about the choice, but I know that they mean that it's not like they can't live without it, but also it is their way of life to do this while tending.
Right. Play isn't maybe the right word.
I think it's just not the right word.
It's just not the right word.
Even if we decide not to be really harsh about the assessment of the choice of that word, we can just say there's probably better words for that. Yeah,
casual farming maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. It's like part of an evolving way of life.
Right.
For sure. And they do point out on page 271 that maybe a more technical term for what they're talking about is, quote, low-level food production, unquote.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. That doesn't sound as fun, probably.
Yeah, which is really like almost the opposite as far as tone. Play farming, it's like it rolls off the tongue really easily. It conveys something in kind of a poetic way, but it has some downsides. But then, low-level food production was actually a term that was coined by an anthropologist, I believe, maybe, named Bruce Smith. They cite an article of his that I went and read called Low-Level Food Production by Bruce Smith, 2001. And it's a great article. It's really good. I'll link to it in the show notes. I mean, it's good in just like, it starts from this place where he very aptly describes this conundrum in trying to tell the story of various peoples on the earth and just trying to understand foragers versus agriculturalists as like modes of subsistence, but then how there's this vast territory that is not 100% hunter-gatherer forager life way, and it's not firmly in agricultural camp either, that is been not very well mapped, but also there's a lot of like terminological is that a word? Conundrums inside the territory, like what does the word cultivation mean? Like what does,
let's call it semantic.
Semantic problems with just like how we talk about the territory,
Right.
all of it. But I'm going to bite my tongue and avoid going into it in more depth because it would be fun to describe it more. But he's like, so I believe that the best term to describe all of what's happening in the middle zone as a whole, without really describing what each type of people were doing, is low-level food production. And it's just the driest and most boring term. And he kind of admits that in there. But, what it's meaning to capture is that these were people who were engaging in food production of one kind or another. Like they were actually doing something to amplify the amount of food that was available to them. Whether it was just doing wild tending in pretty focused ways, or they were actually, had domesticated species. And then all of this, like they point out that squashes were domesticated in Mesoamerica in like 8,000 BC.
Wow.
But you don't see agriculture for 5,000 years after that.
Right.
So people had domesticated plants and were spreading their seeds and stuff, but not in an agricultural context for 5,000 years. So, but they were invested in planting squash seeds and growing them out in various ways, but it was just enmeshed in this very flexible way of life that involved a lot of foraging and hunting and everything, all this stuff too. So, but low-level food production is maybe the alternative to play farming.
Well,
whatever. It's more the concept that matters than the name.
Yeah. I mean, like, kind of low intensity. I don't know. I mean, maybe intensified foraging, forest gardening. Like, I don't know. Like, I think that forest gardening sounds like a good one. You're growing.
But
some
it wasn't
food.
always forest gardening for people.
Right. That's true.
Like
That's true.
The idea is that you want a broad
term for it.
Anyway, so this is a problem that we're probably not going to solve here. Maybe we will. Maybe we will. But, low level makes it sound like these people were living below their potential.
Right.
Or something. And I don't like that aspect of it. But it means that their food production was not at a very intensified
it was
level.
low intensity.
Low intensity food production. Like they weren't maximizing calories. They weren't hitched to a machine of expansion in the way that the states would become.
They point out here too that these people's way of life made them partially resistant to being assimilated or absorbed by different states or by the state, because their life way was resistant to that in some ways.
Yet this is the other part to that, though, which I want to make sure that we represent this too. But part of what the Davids want to say here is that these people, they were doing something that was like robust and productive enough that it could maybe be considered a civilization.
That's true. Yeah.
So they talk about how these people were connected through canoe trade routes over very vast distances, that they had cultural webs and cultural affinities that tied them together in a way that they weren't necessarily tied as much to their neighbors who were living in different ways. And that you can see this sort of vast civilization, like interconnected peoples of Arawakan speaking languages that all had like variations on this one kind of way of doing things. And they all lived sort of close to the rivers and traveled by canoe and traded with each other. And when colonizers found these people, they described large towns and settlements, and sometimes even chiefdoms that were supported by these like not quite farming, minimally invested in cultivation and food production, but a lot of like just wild food harvesting and foraging and stuff like that. So they want to, at one time, they're saying two things at the same time. On one, they're saying that there was a pretty advanced level of like
social organization
and like, even to call it civilization, that was happening, supported by this type of subsistence. And also that these folks could pretty well resist being incorporated into colonial states that would come later.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think that they don't quite say this, but maybe we could also say that this means of subsistence was not conducive to this civilization kind of evolving into the state.
Mm-hmm. Oh, right.
Either, right? Because, I mean, in the Americas, you do see like grain-based, sort of state-like formations.
Right.
In
Empire.
Mesoamerica, like Maya, Aztec, like this type of thing too. And these folks weren't going there, and we could make the materialist observation that this way of life did not produce the kinds of like agricultural commodities and things that, following from James C. Scott, that make the state possible. And I think that they are pointing that out there in here too. I mean, even though they like shy away from the heavily materialist explanations a lot, they still point out, they do say that, this is a quote, elaborate and unpredictable subsistence routines are an excellent deterrent against the colonial state. It is difficult to tax and monitor a group that refuses to stay in one location, obtaining its livelihood without making long-term commitments to fixed resources or growing much of its food invisibly underground, as with tubers and other root vegetables. And the footnote there is directly to James C. Scott. So they're really calling that in and talking about these people as being resistant to not just the colonial state, but just the emergence of the state.
Well, that brings us back to the idea of the ecology of freedom.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so what is the ecology? And so, I personally, whether or not they're meaning to do this, am excited that ecology is in the picture. Because even though Bookchin was talking about social ecology and the interconnectedness between ecology and humans, but that's aside. That's not how they're using it. And they maybe are more talking about human ecology, like way of life. What I would say is there seems to be a really strong connection to place. And that what I was going to say earlier when we were talking about the other examples is that with these 4 examples, the Central Europe, Amazonia, the Nilotic peoples, and the Oceania, who would become the Pacific Islanders possibly, that what we see, I just think it's interesting that the people who are like violently annihilated and their way of life decimated were the sedentary people, and who also seem to be building up hierarchies.
Oh, yeah.
During their lives.
Right.
The point being that, like, what I'm seeing here, though, is that when there is more of a resistance to hierarchy buildup, there's movement, moving around, not having a single place to defend. Right. And maybe not having a concentration of resources.
And a concentration of grains.
And a concentration of grains, right. Another thing, though, that I consider when I think about Amazonia specifically is that, yes, there's these lifeways that are very resistant to leading to state production. Yeah. That don't produce states and can be resistant to being recouped by the state. But really, it depends on the amount of pressure that they're living near, Like when there is an actual empire nearby or a capitalist venture, say, of extraction, whether that's mining, rubber production, there's so many horrific stories of extraction in the Amazon in which the indigenous populations were forcibly brought into the labor and lost their lives to that labor in great numbers. When even if you have a lifeway that is resistant to producing a state and is built on an ecology of freedom, it really depends on your proximity to empire or state with more force. And some of you can get away, but all of you will not get away, depending on how much pressure there is coming from that outside force. So I don't know. I still want there to be more context, kind of, or at least acknowledge that there can be outer pressures that affect whether or not you get to enjoy this ecology of freedom,
Yeah. So you're starting to think about what this means in the bigger scheme of things, or what would become of these ways of life going forward into history?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, there are still people living in Amazonia in very similar ways to this.
Right.
But within the history
Yeah.
of Amazonia post colonization, I mean, colonization is ongoing, but post that initial contact,
Right.
there are many, many horror stories. And even pre-Spanish arrival, there were interactions with empire that were sometimes violent, even with the empire that was indigenous to that area.
Yeah.
So yes, things got much worse once capitalism and extractive settler colonialism was happening, but there was there was still pressure sometimes depending on proximity to the empires around them.
Right. Yeah, I think you're kind of getting at this question of what does all of this mean in the big picture? How far can these ecologies of freedom be taken?
I mean, it kind of relates to what you were talking about in the last episode because, none of this is happening in a vacuum.
Right. Yeah, the Davids actually kind of acknowledge this at the end in a weird way because we're basically at the end of the chapter here.
Right.
After the Amazonia part, they have this section that says but why does it all matter? But the way that they portray this is that they come up with an imaginary someone who they call a skeptical reader. And they're surely the skeptical reader might object. What matters in the wider scheme of things are not the first faltering steps toward agriculture, but its long-term effects. And they bring in the observation, right, that in the long term, if you're looking at the history of humanity on the planet, that we do witness this greater domination of agriculturally driven civilization. And like you were saying, there's still people alive today who have these freer ecologies still, who get to enjoy it still on the planet.
But there's fewer and fewer of them.
And so if you're trying to tell the history of humanity, like the book is trying to do, then there's still this question of what do we get from having a clearer picture of the faltering first steps or, the nonlinear and very diverse early days of agriculture. And the way that the Davids, their imaginary skeptic, actually asks a couple of kind of good questions where they ask over the long term, weren't the odds surely stacked in favor of those who could intensify land use to sustain ever larger and denser populations? Right. And that calls back to what I was saying in the Against the Grain episode about how the demographic expansion, the population expansion, and the pursuant hunger for people and land that certain kinds of agriculturally driven empires have.
And their ability to just reproduce in vast numbers.
Yeah, exactly. Can account for this domination of agriculture over the long term. Now, the Davids don't actually provide these types of explanations. They clearly have read Against the Grain, but they don't actually take these skeptical questions to the answers. They actually veer off, just to set the stage for the next chapter, which is going to be about cities. So they bring up these questions from an imaginary skeptic kind of to no end. So I guess maybe, I don't know if they just don't think that those are very interesting questions. But if we think so, then we can at least maybe turn to James Scott for some of the answers that I don't think that the Davids really disagree with. There's even some parts of the chapter in here that I'm not going to read out, but I see them kind of pointing out the types of features of cultures that they're talking about that would have drawn James Scott's attention as far as whether they were set up for or set up to resist the emergence of the state, right? So they do kind of operate within that framework, but they're just not here. I guess that they're not here to account for how agricultural civilization eventually did become dominant. They just want to expand our imagination about the different ways that domesticated plants and animals could appear in human life in ways that don't just inexorably feed in to the machine of empire.
Yeah, I think that, again, they want to shake up the notion that agriculture looks one way. That it always leads to state building and hierarchy.
Yeah.
and that the train goes in one direction.
Yeah. Right.
And so they've
Right.
given us a lot of examples of that, right? Different ways it can look. I mean, again, the ones that happen to not have grain seem to do better.
Yeah, right.
The people who can move around
Yeah.
do better at resisting state building.
Right.
So, that's still in there and it's still going to be something we need to think about. But they have stretched our imaginations and our perspective some to show the diversity and non-linearity of agriculture emergence.
And knowing that you can support fairly large populations and complex civilization, complex culture without grains.
That's great.
Is a good thing to know.
That is a good thing to know.
Right? And that grains seem to be so important for the state is also a good thing to know.
It is.
I mean, does this mean that we're going to have to torch wheat fields, when people try and grow them? I was just reading an article about parts of Mexico in the state of Michoacan, which is avocado country, where some communities ban avocado growing and actually cut them down.
Just to stay out of the violence of that economy.
To avoid the violence that the avocado trade is accompanied by. And so
right.
Is a similar strategy going to be necessary for grains? I don't know.
Right.
I would like to be more hopeful about it than that.
But it is really, it's worth pointing out that we're not only addicted to grains in our diets, but our minds and the way that we even think of what is possible is limited by grains, not just because of their effect on the mind, but because of the fact that that's what we think agriculture is, 1-to-1, if we're not trying to think outside of the dominant system.
Right. And that's what we think sustains
masses
of people.
Right.
And it does now.
Right. But you don't have to do it that way.
Yeah. But we need a different imaginary.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I gotta say I'm excited to talk about cities next time. That's another, what's the name of the next chapter?
Imaginary cities.
Imaginary cities.
Eurasia's first urbanites in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Ukraine, and China, and how they built cities without kings.
All right. Well, that's exciting.
Yeah. I like cities.
I like cities too. We don't live in a city. We live pretty quite rurally, but I do enjoy them.
Not everybody would agree with me on this, but I think that there is something inherently utopian about cities. So I'm down for it. And that'll be next time.
Yeah.
Okay, we're glad to be back. Bye.
When we sing through the emptiness, when the sun falls on our eyes, we are silent. Joy is the day, quiet